Good evening, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Philanthropy as the Bridge for Impact in India's Growth. Insights from the India Philanthropy Report 2024. My name is Mahima, and I work with Dasta's Researchers Insights team. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. It's nice to see some old friends in the room, as well as many new folks. As you know, we are hosting this webinar today to talk about the India Philanthropy Report, or the IPR. Our aim with this webinar is to provide the development community with an overview of the IPR, to answer any questions you may have about philanthropy models as they relate to your work, and to help the audience situate themselves within India's philanthropy landscape. In today's webinar, we will cover history of the IPR and some of the key trends in the private sector giving. We will dive into cohort-wise insights for the CSR and family philanthropy. We will also discuss strategies for overcoming challenges and achieving success in collaborative philanthropy in India. Lastly, we will highlight how the IPR can be a valuable resource for you and your philanthropic initiatives. Before beginning today's program, a couple of quick announcements. This webinar is being recorded and being live streamed on YouTube. Second, over the course of this presentation, as questions begin to emerge, please feel free to send them to us via chat, and we will do our best to answer to them at the end. And lastly, at the end of the webinar, we would love to hear your thoughts on how it went and request you to take a few moments to fill out our feedback form. I'll now introduce our speakers for the day. First, we will hear from Prachi Pal. Prachi drives thought leadership on philanthropy mainstreaming in India. She has shaped and co-authored several research and media publications, including the India Philanthropy Report 2024. We also have with us Rupsha Mitra, who is a key member of Dasra's Research and Insights team and a core contributor to the 2024 edition of India Philanthropy Report. Her work focuses on generating evidence-based insights with a bias for action that can guide strategic philanthropy. I'll now hand it over to my colleague Prachi to cover key insights from the report.
Thank you, Mahima. Before I jump in, thanks, Mahima. So I think we can start with the history of the India Philanthropy Report. And this has been a long-standing partnership with Bain & Company and Dasra. This IPR 2024 is the 14th edition of this report. We've had this partnership for 14 years. And one of the around philanthropy in India, very limited insights, so as for us to draw a long-term trend line of what is it that is happening in the Indian philanthropy landscape, right? So it's co-published by Dasra and Bain year on year, where Dasra brings its strategic focus and qualitative research insights, whereas Bain contributes with a very strong quantitative, legal and marketing rigor to the report. Over the years, the report has discussed annual growth and key trends in the Indian philanthropy landscape, covering diverse thematics across many years. But the report took a strategic focus in 2021 and 2022, where we've consistently tracked similar indicators to be able to draw a long-term trend line of being able to see what is really happening in that space. The report captures data from the last 5 years and tries to project what can be trends that we might expect in the next 5 years. And because now we're tracking similar indicators, we hope to see testing some of our hypotheses happening in the coming few editions of the report as well. It also provides perspective on the forces driving the shift in the philanthropic momentum in India and highlights major hurdles, constraints in giving, and shares possible solutions and implications to address them. In today's webinar, we will cover the top highlights from the report. but we would encourage you to download and read the report also for yourselves. But we'll also, towards the end, like Mahima mentioned, discuss what the report insights mean for each of the stakeholder groups that have joined us today, which includes funding organizations, NGO partners, folks from academia, folks who are independent researchers, or intermediary organizations, etc. So moving on to just overall give you a viewpoint on the Indian philanthropy landscape and what have been the key milestones that have defined the philanthropy sector over the past decade, right? Bear with me, the slide looks a little complicated, but I will take you through it slowly. What the slide showcases is that from 2020, 2010 to 2030, what has been happening, but also what are we foreseeing. So from 2010 to 2015, we're basically looking at inflection points that have really impacted that particular 5-year period, where there was quick which happened in 2008, which led to greater giving. Key inflection points that happened in this particular 5-year period was that India had the CSR law, which got mandated in 2013. India is a unique country where we're one of the only ones who have this kind of a law mandated CSR regulation. We also saw institutional as well as own and operate family foundations set up India-wide in this 5-year period. We also saw early partnerships to build institutions. For example, the Ashoka University came on in 2014. This period also saw the Azim Premji Foundation, Piramal Foundation, Reliance Foundation set up their bases in India. Moving on to the next 5-year period, which is 2015 to 2020. In this particular 5-year period, we saw professional advisory happening in the country and big bets by global players who started to shape the ecosystem. And why the focus on global is largely because in 2015, we saw the Sustainable Development Goals were launched by the United Nations. Large global players deepened their focus in India, for example, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Co-Impact, Omidyar Network, and it also saw the international intermediaries like Britspan enter into the space and domestic intermediary players also diversify, for example, Satwa, right? Moving on to from 2020 to 25, which is a bit of a more recent timeline, where co-solutioning is something that we are increasingly seeing becoming the norm with the pandemic happening in 2020 and long-term effects of the pandemic that we continue to see. Trust barriers actually came down in that period. We saw greater giving happening. People were a lot more generous because people saw the great amount of suffering that was around them, right? And that is why we also saw collaborative action happening in this space. And we understand and anticipate that, to solve really complex problems like gender equity, poverty, hunger, and anything else that pertains to the SDG space, only philanthropy will not be the answer to these problems. Diverse stakeholders from funding landscape, NGO partners, governments, private sector, CSR, everybody has to come together on the same table and be able to co-solutionize to really be able to solve for these problems and build a version of our country where no one is left behind and literally build like an India of our dreams. And that's what we anticipate led to the 5x jump in the collaboratives which have been set up since the pandemic. A few examples include the Young India Philanthropic Pledge, the ACT grants, Accelerate India Philanthropy, Giving Pie, which is anchored by Dasra, Annamaya, and the likes. And moving on to a more aspirational part of the 5-year period, which is 2025 up to 2030, where we have the timeline to kind of meet the SDGs. What we're anticipating and seeing in the sector are positive directional shifts, which cannot be right now. They're not as solid for us to say that they are trends, but they're pockets of the future in a way where they have the potential to become trends in the future and really drive the vibrant, evolving landscape of Indian philanthropy. And from in this period, what we're expecting, and that's what data also shows, that India is going to see an increase in wealth creation. We've already been seeing that for the past few years, but that's going to continue is what we anticipate from the data point of view. We've also been seeing domestically led collaborative giving models increasing, which I already spoke about in 2020 to 25 segment. We're also seeing family giving, particularly among the affluent and high net worth individuals, including professionals who are C-suite executives, really picking up. And we see these are areas where there's great potential for Indian philanthropy to be able to shape global outcomes. And if India can solve for SDGs, we can really become the hub for experimentation, become like a testing lab where we can actually give the world certain good practices to see, because it's something we feel can work in India. Given the complex and diverse landscape we have, it can be potentially looked at as a successful case study after a few contextual changes to be made for the world to look at as well. With this, I will hand on to my colleague Rupsha to take you through the archetypes of stakeholders who exist in the landscape of philanthropy and also the key highlights from this year's report. Rupsha, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Prachi. I hope I'm audible. So before we get into understanding what the trends look like, as we've already captured in our report, it becomes important to understand what does this ecosystem look like and who are the key players who are really shaping the private sector giving. So when we look at private philanthropy, it essentially comes from two major sources. The first one is foreign funding, and the second one are the domestic philanthropists. So foreign funding, it comes from givers who also can be institutional givers or individuals, but they're located outside India. And when we look at domestic philanthropists, this also include further cohorts or typologies. And as you can see on your screen, I would take you through one by one by explaining what they look like and what they provide as. So the first one are the corporates, and they give through corporate social responsibility, which is more commonly known as CSR. And since CSR became a mandate through law, India definitely became a front runner in doing so. So that essentially urged and supported a lot more companies to give 2% of their net profit. And it really helped in improving and bolstering the giving from CSR expenditures. The second cohort, as you can see, is called the retail giving. So this kind of giving is when people like you and me, we use platforms like Milap or Keto. These are common crowdfunding platforms, and we can give in smaller contributions to causes which might be very close to us. And this is therefore happening in a very unorganized manner. So that is one way through which retail is when we look at it from a formal way, where donations go directly to organizations or disaster relief funds with limited intervention of crowdfunding platforms. And currently, what we are seeing is that nearly 78% of this retail giving is actually happening informally. The third cohort, and that is a cohort that is very heterogeneous in nature, is called the family philanthropy cohort. And this is heterogeneous because we can further classify them based on different determinants. So for example, the first determinant that we see to categorize is in terms of their net worth. So for example, if they are an ultra high net worth individual or UHNIs, as you will see when we're describing the trends, they are typically those individuals whose net worth is more than 1,000 crores. Then we have the high net worth individuals or the HNIs, and their net worth is between 200 to 1,000 crores. And then we have the affluent individuals, and their net worth is between 7 to 200 crores. So that is one determinant based on which we do the categorization. The second determinant is based on the origin of wealth, which means how have they created their wealth, and that is how we also further map them. So the first one is whether they have inherited it or if they are first generation wealth creators. So when we say they have inherited the wealth, it means that they are intergenerational givers who belong to long-standing philanthropy families. Some common examples are, for example, the Tatas or the Azim Premji or Shiv Nadar, who have contributed for a very long time. And when their children inherit this wealth, they continue to give back. So that is what we call the intergenerational giver cohort. Then the second one is the first generational wealth creators. These are individuals who have created wealth at present and not from before. And they might have done this through jobs, whom we call professional givers. So, like Prachi already mentioned, they mostly form the C-suite executives in the private sector. Or they can also be business owners who have made first generational wealth through their businesses. And then we have a third determinant, which is based on identities. So this would include, for example, women givers who are part of philanthropy endeavors and families, by which we mean cisgendered women who are involved in philanthropy. There can also be another category of, for example, diaspora givers. So this is largely what the different cohorts look like, and they all together form the private giving philanthropy. With that, we can move on to the next slide. So in this slide, we'll understand what, therefore, the status of social sector funding looks like currently in India, and as we've already captured in the report. So this is an analysis of the budget for the current year to be able to see what the giving trends are looking like and what the social sector expenditure trends look like. So according to this analysis, the percentage of GDP that is actually going towards the social sector is increasing, and it grew at 13% over the last 5 years. And primarily, this has been driven by the increased public expenditure that continues to contribute almost 95% of the total social sector spending in the country. Now, if you want to understand how this is getting divided across the sectors, we see that health is one of the key areas where the growth has been diverted towards. And this is majorly due to two schemes. The first one is the National Health Mission and the Jal Jeevan Mission. And this is also, in terms of projection, is expected to reach 30% of the public spend going forward. That is by FY 2028. The second key sector is education. So we're seeing that there is an 11% growth in FY23, and that has been driven by schemes and programs like Samagra Shiksha, Poshan, and the National Education Mission. However, when we're looking at the education spend, that has remained flat at 3% of the GDP, and that is despite the National Education Policy making the mandate, which says that it should be at least 6% of the GDP. Then we have the other cases, and there we see a trend of having a reduction. And the others majorly include schemes like the Manrega scheme, which is the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, and the food subsidy related schemes. So these categorize as social employment schemes, and they support the most vulnerable in the society. But we have seen that there has been a reduction towards these cases. With that, we can move on to the next slide. So this is what the private funding landscape looks like. And I know it looks like a complicated diagram, but we will walk over it slowly. So when we're looking at the overall funding landscape in private philanthropy, we are seeing that it is estimated to grow at 10 to 15% per annum over 2023 till 2028. And this drive is seen primarily due to the growth in family philanthropy, retail, and CSR. You can also see on the graph, there is the figure of 121K crore. And this is the size of private giving in India currently. And this is the capital that we're working with in the social sector. So if we demystify what this 121K crore really looks like and how it is being contributed to by the different segment of givers, we'll see, for example, let's start with foreign private giving. We see that even though there is a consistent growth, but this growth has been very slow over the years. And even though there is a notable increase in FY 2022, that was primarily due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The second segment is the Indian UHNI contribution, and that increased to 6% in FY23 after the last year's drop in which went to 4%. And this increase in contribution was primarily driven by the higher contributions from concurrent donors from 22 to 2023, as we also understand from the Hurun database, which is one of the important sources that we refer to when we also put together the report. And we must also tell you that there are two major key players who really help in creating and really help in moving the trends in the UHNI segment in India. And these two people are primarily Azim Premji and Shiv Nadar. So even because of their significant increase in contribution is the reason why you can also see this total UHNI giving increasing in 2023. In fact, even the drop that happened in 2022, which you can see is at 4%, was largely because of the drop in Azim Premji's contributions. So they really are pushing and they're really influencing how the UHNI segment trends are looking like. Next, we'll see what the HNI and the affluent segments look like. We see that there is a moderate growth of 7%. But this segment is actually a very promising area for us because this segment is something that we project to be seen growing in the most for the times to come. And our data actually tells us that HNI and affluent indicators actually have a higher propensity to give compared to the UHNIs because not only people's wealth is increasing, but the number of individuals who are giving this kind of money to philanthropy, that is also increasing and will increase in India. So there is definitely potential to unlock significant upside potential in donations when it comes to this segment. And in terms of future projections, it also seems that the HNI and the affluent segment really has the potential to reach at least 35%, as you can see in the red box that is demarcated on this slide. And they expect it to be reaching that in FY28 as compared to 22% in FY 2023. We'll now look at CSR and how it is contributing to this. So we can see there is a moderate growth over the years. And if we can quickly go back to the previous slide, in terms of percentages, CSR is also at 7%. And this can be contributed to more companies complying with the CSR mandate, increase in the corporate profits, and also with improvements in regulatory amendments also coming into the picture has certainly encouraged and led to a surge in the number of corporate donors. And it has also helped in improving the transparency when it comes to CSR funding. And this has really helped in improving overall CSR. And this also is interesting because after CSR became mandated in India, it truly put India in a unique position because this mandate is still not in existence in a lot of parts of the world. And therefore, this really guarantees a very predictable amount of funding that can come into the social sector from the CSR spends. And when you couple this with improved regulations, accountability, compliances, and with the rise in corporate profits, it really puts immense potential in CSR growth and CSR funding towards the sector. A quick note on retail. Retail grew at 12%, and this growth can be majorly been seen because of increase in donations to NGOs, increase in community giving, especially in healthcare. And this has also become more seamless. It has become a lot more accessible after UPIs, Unified Payment Interfaces, come into being, after digital giving initiatives became more prominent. So this has really helped in improving retail giving as well. We can move on to the next slide. So now understanding what the overall private giving landscape looks like, we'll now do a double click into what the specific trends look like across these different cohorts. So for the first one, we look at how CSR is doing. So for CSR, healthcare and education are still the funded areas, but we are also seeing a shift towards environment and sustainability as it has also experienced a substantial inflow of CSR funds in the recent years. And on the outset, as we've already mentioned, that CSR has this immense potential of growing and it is estimated to grow. That definitely helps in improving areas of opportunities to direct resources more towards the areas of environment, sustainability, etc. And you can also see that with ESG, for example, which is the environment, social and governance strategies coming into place, with companies required to disclose them through business responsibility and sustainability reporting, at least in the top 1,000 listed companies, that has also been complementary to adding this increased awareness towards environment, towards sustainability. And that is also really helping in diversifying this funding in the landscape as well. But having said that, there is still a long way to go, and CSR spending can definitely be improved with effectiveness. And there are certain ways in which companies can really do that. So, for example, they can create dedicated teams which have clear strategies. They can also provide with specialized training and certifications to CSR professionals. They can also partner with public sector spaces to really supplement resources. So, for example, we see an example coming from the SBI's partnership with NHM Doctor for the doctor training. And it will also be very interesting to see that when they engage with collaboratives, so they can really combine technical expertise, they can really combine on social initiative management, and really unlock these vehicles to improve funding towards the sector as well. Moving forward, we can move on to the next slide. We'll now look at family philanthropy, and the first segment that we look at are the UHNIs. So UHNI donations have also diversified, and when we see this diversification, we see that they have moved towards arts and culture, they have moved towards environment and sustainability. This is something that we're seeing, for example, in terms of arts. There isn't a lot that was happening in 2020, but it definitely started gaining a lot of traction from 2021. And then in 2023, we saw an increase to 30%. And one of the key examples that we can cite for this is with Shiv Nadar's contribution to the institutional building for the new phase of the Kiran Nadar Museum of Art. Secondly, when we're looking at environment and sustainability, we can see that from 2% in 2020, it went to 11% in 2023. And that's also encouraging. And some examples that we can cite for this is the work that Rain Matter Foundation is doing, which is run by Nikhil and Nitin Kamath, and the work that Rain Tree Foundation is doing, that is run by Leena Dandekar. They're really focusing on climate solutions. They're doing narrative building for better adaptation to community resilience. Similar trends for HNI and affluent givers. As already mentioned, it's a very promising segment. And with more number of people giving to philanthropy, with more wealth accumulation, we also see a good potential in improvements in their diversification as well, and more giving towards the social sector. Moving on, I will hand it over to Prachi to do a deeper dive into the other cohorts.
Thank you, Rupsha. So, doing a deep dive was Dastra incubated 2 years ago this network called Giving Pie. It's India's first family-focused philanthropy network. And some of the data that you see on this slide, while it looks like a very complicated table, we'll take you through it slowly, of course. This is based on one-to-one conversations with about 122 members from the Giving Pie network, which include family philanthropists, like I mentioned. And as earlier stated, that the family philanthropy landscape in India is quite heterogeneous and quite diverse. So in the last year's report in 2023, we did a first cohortization of our data on origin of wealth, where we said that intergenerational givers who are inheriting wealth from traditional family philanthropic families, how are their interests and motivations different from the now generation who are actually first generation wealth creators in their families. But in this year's report, because we had a larger database as well, we did 2 more cuts to understand how are women philanthropists, what are their interests like, how can their giving be comparable to others in the sector. And when we look at the source of wealth creation for now gen givers, they're either creating wealth, like Rupsha explained while she was sharing about the key stakeholders in the sector. There are 2 ways to create fresh wealth, either through a job, which is professional givers, or you own a business, which is basically business owners. So let me take you through the top insights of what has emerged in this year's analysis. The first is the key sectors of interest across these givers, right? So traditional sectors, which we define as education and healthcare, continue to be areas where now-gen and intergen givers have kind of wanted to focus on and continue to focus. However, there is a diversification in their approach. They're focusing on a lot more system change initiatives, which rely on data, technology, collaboration, because they come with a fresh level of thinking. They come with almost a risky approach to philanthropy, almost an entrepreneurial approach to philanthropy, if one may say that. There's growing interest that we are seeing from them in the areas of gender equity, diversity, and inclusion, which is governed as JEDI in this table. There's deeper interest and understanding that they want to have around interconnected issues, right? And climate action has also emerged as one area where there's a lot of focus. Now, climate is something that hitherto the overall narrative around climate has been on mitigation efforts. How can one reduce their carbon footprint? But now, increasingly, especially between now gen and intergen givers, they want to focus on and are increasingly focusing on how can there be, how can we support communities at the grassroots level be more adaptable, and how can they be more resilient towards climate change? Because natural disasters have increased. We are really seeing the kind of impact of climate change happening. So there's a greater need to invest in community resilience and adaptability, but also the entire climate narrative is extremely jargonized, very difficult to understand, can be very technical. Therefore, this cohort is also quite keen to understand and invest in mainstreaming the narrative of climate. What does this segment need? How can grassroots experiences actually be leveraged? And how can the climate story become something where it's not so much of a technical language? Moving on to women givers. What we're again similarly seeing is that they're quite inspired to give to JEDI-focused initiatives. This could largely be attributed to what we've seen in our conversations of their personal experiences, and them bringing a gender lens to their giving, because they can understand through their own lived journeys of relating to the very personal level of how gender impact some of the issues, and how gender kind of impacts some of the communities, and how some of the communities are actually governed, vulnerable, and marginalized when we're kind of not looking at gender as an important lens in the whole segment. What we're also seeing is that this may also contribute towards shifting of power dynamics in this space, but early stages to kind of be able to say that. And examples actually include givers who've been long-standing inspirations for giving in the sector, from the likes of Rohini Nilekani or Anu Aga and Rati Forbes, to newer givers, which include Leena Dandekar, Amira Shah, and the likes. Looking at professionals and businesses in terms of their sectors, again, very similar in terms of wanting to focus on education and healthcare, which are traditional sectors, but also having an interest and trying to kind of understand the spaces of climate action as well as JEDI. What's extremely interesting is the aspirational areas of where they now kind of want to devote their funding to, and what are areas that they're quite keen to give to. And for NGO partners on this call, on this webinar, might be very interesting to take note of some of these areas. The first is, of course, education and health, which kind of continues, though the percentages look slightly lesser than what a current giving happens. So 21%, 17%, as you can see from the table. One of the largest segments that we've seen, and that's extremely positive for the sector, is their interest and keenness to invest in something that we govern as ecosystem strengthening, which simply means that they want to invest in areas such as capacity building needs of NGO partners, investing in areas that streamline systems and processes of NGOs, investing in data, investing in more research. There's such less data in the Indian philanthropy landscape. Aggregated data for gender is even lesser. And the IPR provides, because it's a flagship publication, provides the first of its kind insights on women givers for the first time. So these are segments within ecosystem strengthening, which kind of forms the bedrock of how does one make giving easier and make giving better? How can we invest in things like having more networks, having more pool funds? Basically, anything that really helps improve the health of the segment can be considered as ecosystem strengthening, which is not tagged to a particular cause as such, but the larger improving of giving, but also larger effectiveness of NGO operations. And JEDI has also emerged as one focus area. The need and the keenness from funders to understand vulnerability, marginalization. JEDI can include mental health, it includes disability, it includes gender, old people, and this awareness to want to understand how does some of these areas actually become barriers, and how can one actually have a gender lens or equity lens or a diversity lens to their giving. While they may be giving to a certain segment, these lenses are extremely important to be able to be more equitable in their giving and making sure that kind of no one is left behind. It's a very small snippet of the what all the IPR kind of contains around family philanthropy and the deep dive. In the interest of time, I'll move on to the next segment, but I will encourage you to go to the report and really give it a thorough read. This table is actually longer in the report, but we've kind of kept it smaller in this particular webinar time constraints. And one note on three aspirations for business owners and professionals also look very similar, so I'll not kind of repeat that. But the idea is that given that family philanthropy is one of the most flexible forms of giving, what we're seeing is that the role that it can really play is really catalytic in nature. It can really invest in helping India become almost like a learning lab, helping with pilot grants, helping with flexible funding, so that things that CSR is not able to fund due to regulatory constraints, things that retail givers are not going to be able to fund, that is the role that family philanthropy now increasingly needs to play, as it has a great history of supporting the country with nation building as early as the independence movement or when the liberalization happened. And as India is now inching towards fresh decade of really of opportunity and economic growth, and also towards the 100-year mark of independent India in 2047, there's a catalytic role that family philanthropy can really play. And all of these cohorts, which are having different interests and understanding in the sector, are all really important. So every single stakeholder group within the segment, be it CSR, be it retail, be it families, each of those cohorts are important. Each of those cohorts have a very unique role to play. And therefore, this entire segment of private philanthropy needs to come together to be able to really move the needle on some of the most complex problems that we face as a country today. That closes the segment on private philanthropy as such from the report. I'll now move on to the last segment from the report, which is around collaboratives. As I mentioned earlier, in 2020 and 2025 5-year period, we really saw that collaboratives have picked up in the country, particularly domestic collaboratives. There's greater understanding and realization around this idea that philanthropy only cannot solve these issues. Multiple stakeholder groups, which include NGO partners, private sector, families, individual givers, governments, both national and state, all of them need to come together to be able to solve these problems from its very root. Therefore, multi-stakeholder approaches and shifting focus from individual giving and more collaborative endeavors is what we've seen happen in the last 4-year period from 2020 up to present day. Looking at the first column on this slide, what we've seen is that there's been a 5x increase in the number of collaboratives which have been established since the pandemic. So in the 2 decades from 1999 to 2019, there were only 27 domestic collaboratives which existed. But in a 3-year period of 2020 to 2023, we've seen 30 collaboratives emerge. So there's almost a 5x jump that we're able to see in collaboratives in this segment. And this growth can be understood to be driven by the effectiveness and the need to solve intricate challenges through collective efforts, as I mentioned. When we look at the second graph on the sheet, on the slide, we can see that intermediaries have increasingly become anchors of some of these collaboratives. So 42% of these domestic collaboratives that we analyzed for this report, we're seeing that intermediaries have been anchoring. Intermediaries actually provide a very neutral and structured environment and trying to balance the interests of different stakeholder groups, which may be part of the collaborative and can really serve as strategic guideposts and facilitate coordination around certain different things that a collaborative might need, right? Which includes grant management, governance structures, expertise aligning on common operational efficiencies and inefficiencies as such. And when we look at the third graph on the slide, what it showcases is what are those areas where these collaboratives have actually emerged and what are those sectors, what are those themes. And what we've seen is that there's a greater focus on climate action and ecosystem strengthening since 2020. Climate-focused collaboratives have really come up, and collaboratives which actually help philanthropy become easier, philanthropy become better, have also emerged, and the examples are already there on the slide, as you can see. Therefore, what we've concluded in the report around collaboratives based on this analysis of domestic collaboratives is that collaborative giving in India holds a lot of promise, but it does face a lot of hurdles, right? And this includes all kinds of challenges from operational inefficiencies, partners falling out, not having long-term funding to be able to run the collaborative in the first place, because there's so many diverse stakeholders in the collaborative. It can be challenging to bring all of them on the same page, and all of these challenges can actually result in a collaborative falling through, right? Therefore, these complexities actually arise when we try to estimate the kind of impact the collaborative has actually had and the kind of roles and responsibilities the partners can actually hold on to. Having said that, there's great opportunity that we see in the Indian landscape for collaboratives to continue to take shape. And what global best practices have showcased is that if philanthropy can really invest in strengthening the domestic momentum around these collaboratives by strengthening the civil society organizations and NGOs from the very core, by increasing their investment in systems and processes and capacity building of NGOs as strong institutions, actually CSO partners can become anchors of some of these collaborative efforts. And what global best practices indicate is that tackling these root causes can trigger systemic shifts, and all of this can really be anchored and led by local funders and civil society organization. So what remains to be seen is the kind of domestic momentum that collaboratives can actually shape in India. There are efforts happening and efforts continue to increase in this space, but it's early years of collaboration to kind of take shape in the shape and form it is right now in the sector, but definitely a lot more strengthening from the Indian philanthropists, the domestic philanthropists, to actually strengthen NGOs into stronger institutions and anchors of collaboratives will actually go a long way for the country to be able to achieve some of the outcomes that we kind of need to achieve as a nation. That is all that we wanted to share from the report. But one interesting question that we've been mulling over and probably kind of also motivated you all to join the webinar is, what does all of this information mean for me, right? Like, why should I listen to all of this data? Why is this important? So let me go segment wise in explaining how can some of what we've shared today and some of what you can pick up as you go back to the report and read more actually help you, or go back to previous editions of the report and look at future editions of the report. Is that for funders, the number of UHNIs in India is increasing, wealth is growing, and therefore there's a significant opportunity for growth. Therefore, funders can and must use this data point to really reflect on their giving potential and being able to do more, and give better. For HNIs and affluent segments who have a strong inclination towards philanthropy, like Rupsha mentioned, this is a very high potential segment. Therefore, they must look to come to the fore a bit more, and for intermediaries to be able to engage with this group a lot more. We've also anticipated in the report that CSR is poised for growth, which opens an opportunity for multi-year grants and a long-term approach from a CSR point of view, not just a one-year type funding. When we look at NGO partners, I want to stress more on this segment, particularly in today's webinar, is that if you have a great understanding of the funding landscape in India, it'll actually help establish a solid baseline to really understand which funder actually fits which need that you may have. For example, what we've said in the previous year's report is that CSR initiatives are well suited to programs which have tried and tested methodologies and are looking to scale where successful pilots have been there. There may be immediate community needs that you have. So looking to invest in storytelling, which really drives retail funders from these platforms like a Give, Keto, Milap, etc. It really is an emotional click of a button where they'll go and really make that contribution, right? So it's important to understand which type of funder is suited to which kind of need that you may have. And family philanthropy is quite well suited to flexibility, capacity building, setting up your systems and processes that may be needed. And lastly, understanding from this landscape what are the key emerging areas of focus from funders so that you can map your programs accordingly and align yourself with some of these funder needs and be more strategic and targeted in the way funders are approached. I'll keep it very brief for intermediaries as such, which is to continue investing in vehicles, networks, platforms that actually strengthen the philanthropy ecosystem and bring more funders and NGO partners together for greater knowledge exchange, greater learning, stronger feedback loops, and greater listening of good practices, and continuing to do what is being done, but also continue to build a strong bridge between funders as well as NGO partners, but also bring in more stakeholders in the room with collaborative efforts such as government, private sector, and the likes. And for people on the webinar who may be independent researchers, students, or just generally have a keen interest in philanthropy, I think the IPR, given that there's such a lack of data in the Indian landscape, the IPR can be a great source as a foundational resource for expanding research in philanthropy. You can use this data to build a more stronger analysis on certain areas which may not be funded, leverage IPR for analyzing IPR data through the years, which is see a long form trend of what the data kind of shows and pose interesting and important questions for the sector, and bring in more case studies and good practices by using this data to be able to contribute to greater literature that is available, which can actually help NGO partners as well as funders to really play their role and being able to really move the needle on the outcomes that we see as a country. That we need to see as a country, right? So there's positivity, there's optimism that we hold in our hearts. There's a lot of aspiration and enthusiasm that we hold, but we also acknowledge that a lot more work needs to be done and will not be possible if we don't come together as a group to be able to solve for some of these challenges. And with that, I will stop. Thank you so much for your patient listening. We have received certain questions in the chat box, which I will try and address as we go along, and probably bring in Rupsha as well. Continue sending us your questions if there are more. In case we are not able to address all of them, we'll try our best to get back to you. So the first question that we've got is, do we have any data on foreign giving? Funds given to NPOs having FCRA. So we do track certain foreign overarching data, and you can check the report for what we've been able to track. So there's a segment in the graph for foreign giving, but like Rupsha mentioned, that it's been kind of stagnating and stabilized almost. There's greater opportunity for domestic givers, but whatever is available in the IPR for the foreign funding segment is something that you can take a look at. The second question we've got is, how were UHNIs and HNIs chosen for this survey, random sampling from the Hurun database or anything specific? So we do look at all the public sources which are available, which are the Hurun database, and we run certain triangulation, but a large part of the family philanthropy segment, like I mentioned, come from Dasra's one-to-one conversations with 122 members who are part of the Giving Pie network. So these insights have been formed by primary conversations and insights, and then validated by some interviews that we hold with sector experts and triangulated with some of the insights that come in publicly available data sources like a Hurun and some of the likes. So it was not a survey based data. It's been something that the team has kind of spent time doing conversations with these funders, with these philanthropists, and actually then objectified that data and put it into, try to do some data cuts and bring out insights in the report as a case study. Another question is, what role does community giving play in the context of retail philanthropy? Given its informal and unstructured nature, how was it measured? So some part of it's very tough to measure retail giving, and I will take acknowledgement of that. Some of that is measured by tracking the ATG contributions that people report in their ITRs, largely because a large part of retail giving is actually unorganized giving that we do to, let's say, our neighbors or our friends in times of need, or people who support us with our household, etc. Some of that giving is very hard to track. So ATG largely has been something that we've used to track retail donations, and some reporting that happens from Give Keto and Mila portals from their reports as well. Having said that, in terms of role, it plays definitely an important role because, again, it's a flexible form of funding. But this funding will require NGO partners, particularly, to strengthen their storytelling and narrative building efforts, right? Because these campaigns that happen on these portals need to be invested in for people to be able to click that button and give that funding. But there's a lot of potential for this space, and it serves as a flexible segment for the NGO partners who receive that funding. Another question that we've received is, can we share successful examples of collaboratives in the education space? There are many examples in climate space, but not in education and healthcare. So I think the one example we shared for healthcare is Anamaya space. From the top of my mind, I can't think of an education collaborative as such, because what we've tracked is what we've seen greater interest emerging in climate and ecosystem strengthening. But healthcare is definitely Anamaya. For education collaboratives, cannot find the name right now, but we'll definitely happy to get back on that should we be able to find some examples which we may be missing right now. Another question is, what are the gaps within philanthropy mindset approach and also NGO mindset that needs to be taken cognizance of and worked upon? I think this can be a whole webinar in and of itself, but I'll keep this short. A large part of philanthropy, what we're seeing and what we continue to urge and we see in our work, is that the approach for this great work happening, but philanthropy increasingly now needs to be bolder. And by bolder, I mean riskier, right? To step out of their comfort zones, to be more innovative and almost entrepreneurial in their thinking, in terms of what will it take to solve that problem, and not being afraid of failure, right? And having very strong feedback loops and listening to the community partners. While that is happening, there's of course there can be a lot more improvement also in that space, because who is at the grassroots knows what's really happening in that space. So if there's stronger feedback loops, there can almost be a co-solutioning of initiatives between funding partners and NGOs, right? So there is greater listening that needs to happen. There's this entire power dynamic between funders and NGO partners, which continuously needs to be kind of solved for. But I think my one big answer to a large gap Instead of a gap, I probably say a large opportunity that stays in this space is for philanthropy to be bolder and to say if this requires, what will it take to solve this from the root, right? I don't want to solve a particular small part of the problem. How can I solve the entire problem, right? Can I imagine an India which is poverty free? It's very complex, it's very challenging, but what does it take? What will it take? And can I have a commitment towards it which is beyond my comfort zone as such? And
Rajesh, I can also add to that.
Sure, go ahead.
So another thing that also becomes extremely important and that becomes the need of the hour in the social sector is to really look for patient capital, to look for grants and support that is long term, to look for grants and support which is multi-year in nature. And this can really help in de-risking innovations that want to come into place. It can really help in scaling initiatives that are at the grassroots level, and we have seen success stories, and we can really use those to the benefits and use philanthropy in that. And it can also benefit from going beyond point solutions. It can really help in not only providing that required support, it can also help in addressing secondary issues. It can help in addressing tertiary issues by really approaching it with a systemic kind of a lens. So this is also one of the spaces that philanthropy can definitely look at in a much better manner. There are also groups within the philanthropic space. For example, when we look at the professional givers or the affluent givers, most of them are first generational givers. Most of them are first time givers to the philanthropic space. So there is a lot of knowledge building also, which becomes important. And to be able to create these vehicles in terms of philanthropic infrastructure, in terms of creating a repository that can also tell these givers how they can give better, the channels that they can look at by providing these resources, because most of them are capable of doing it. They are willing to do it, but perhaps right now they don't have the right information to know how to go about it. So if collaboratives are also brought into this space to improve learning, to improve these kind of spaces and infrastructures, that can also help in boosting philanthropic endeavors in the society. Yeah.
Thanks, Rupsha. Since we're out of time, I'll quickly address the last two questions that we've received. But feel free to write to us in case you have more. Um, Another question is, from the implementation perspective, the greatest challenge lies in connecting with the right donor and showcasing our work to prospective stakeholders. As NPOs are not supposed to spend heavily on marketing, can there be any tech-based model which can solve this problem? I think the leveraging of technology in this space is definitely an area that needs greater investment, brains coming together to think about this and to have a tech-based model which can bring funders and NGO partners to the same platform. Yes, but I think in terms of connecting with the right donor, if you're able to understand through some of the insights we've shared today in terms of which need connects to which stakeholder type, then you can try and do outreach in that manner. So writing to CSRs, and I think I'll just combine the question with the next one that we've got, is that how can NGO and NPOs reach out to UHNIs or HNIs for funding? So I think there is no formal structure per se. I think being a part of any intermediary networks of NGOs is something that's definitely going to give you some signing up for some of these sessions or signing up for some of these events which happen, which can bring you into the network of intermediaries, will be helpful to understand which funders are in that space, but also just looking at their websites, right? Most funding organizations will have email IDs that you can write to. They may have a structure which may be explained. They may not have a structure, in which case you can do some outreach, which is a lot more targeted, and you will be able to kind of hear back from them. So every foundation has its own website as such, but you can try and look at their LinkedIn pages or their websites to be able to write and send proposals to them. If they have proposals in a certain format, then you can try and incorporate that as you reach out to them. Definitely acknowledging the fact that there's greater need for technology to kind of come into this space, and in the fintech space, it's been really, really helpful to bring people on the same platform, but that remains to be seen for the philanthropy space. We don't at the moment have a tested model, but definitely the need is there. And I'll just probably close on one very positive message that we've received, which is co-solutioning is definitely a key term. Capacity building, mindset building required, as well as for both for philanthropists as well as NGOs, and hope to kind of build a pathway to success. Thank you so much. So do we. Once again, thank you so much for joining this conversation. You can scan the QR code on this slide. I should have mentioned this earlier actually to download the report. But you can also go to Dasra's website in the resources section and download the report. And we really hope that this webinar has been helpful in trying to decode some of the technical language that we continue to encounter in the philanthropy space. And we also hope to kind of do more of these and be able to really share more insights your way. Thank you so much for sparing your time for us today.
Hi all, we will also send you a feedback form. So really requesting you all to fill it. Thank you.